I'm sure that the Ukrainians have got sleeper agents inside Russia who, are ready to perform these activities. And, and I think they're probably holding a lot of them in reserve, waiting to see, what happens. And I'm sure that right now Ukraine is preparing its a guerrilla campaign against Russia.
Nicholas Drummond, thank you for speaking to us on The World in 10. Um, we've had this car bomb this morning in Moscow, which has killed Yaroslav Moskalik, who was a strategic general for Russia. Just talk us through. Neither of us are experts in spying and sabotage, but how difficult is this sort of thing to pull off?
We have to remember that a lot of people in Ukraine have relatives in Russia, rather like Northern Ireland and the United Kingdom, where people in the UK have relatives in Northern Ireland. We have the same situation in Ukraine. So a lot of family members are still in Russia and have Ukrainian relatives living in various Ukrainian cities. So it would be quite easy to travel to and fro um, to actually affect an attack like this. So a very similar situation and that kind of freedom of movement. Who is your enemy? And we know we have the same problem here, where we have extreme um, Islamic extremists, committing atrocities here. We don't know who they are. We have to identify them, and Russia will have that same problem.
And how neither of us again have been involved in these sorts of espionage activities and operations, but given your experience of broader military operations, I mean, this must have been far longer planned. Steve Witkoff has arrived in Moscow today for peace talks. Is that in any way linked? Is the timing planned, or do you think this is just a coincidence?
Well, I don't believe in coincidences, and I think it is. I think it is very much linked to what's going on in Moscow. And it'll also be retaliation for the attack in Kharkiv yesterday, which killed a number of Ukrainians. And I think that we have to remember that that Ukraine has to show its own commitment to defending itself, and by reminding Russia that this is not over yet, but it's still very much prepared to defend its interests by whatever means it needs to in order to bring Russia to the negotiating table. So it will be a sobering thing for the Russians, and we'll see what it yields. But it would have taken a bit, a fair amount of planning, of course, and I'm sure that it would have been sort of already drawn up before, and they just had to agree the timing and the opportunity to conduct it.
It sounds like then, when you talk about this, is partly retaliation for strikes on civilians this week, that you sort of have these oven ready plans, as it were, and then you can almost flick a switch and off you go. You get the order to go, and then suddenly the operation gets into full swing.
No, exactly, and it's called a planned escalation. And of course, what we have to think is, what will Russia do in response? Because I mean, we have to just step back from the whole situation here. This whole initiative by Trump is amounts to a US policy that is completely out of step with that of all of his NATO allies, and a peace deal that effectively condones Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine is the same as appeasement, and it sends the worst possible message to China. So really, this is a very difficult situation, and it could lead to an outcome whereby Ukraine and the rest of Europe rejects what America is trying to do, and America becomes an irrelevant player in this whole situation. And of course, if that happens, Trump would obviously decide to remove all US aid. And obviously, we're very keen for that not to happen. But if that were to happen, then the war would need to be waged in a different way, because Ukraine cannot wage a conventional war without considerable Western support. And if it can't do that, it will have to resort to a counterinsurgency style, an insurgency style of guerrilla warfare in order to bring Russia to the negotiating table or to force a Russian withdrawal.
And so, do you see this as part of a shifting Ukrainian tactic? We've seen similar attacks before, which have killed high-ranking Russian generals, often, again, explosions from vehicles in Moscow. Do you think this is a shifting tactic or even strategy even before you get a ceasefire on the front line?
Yes, I think it's signaling what Ukraine could do. We will move from conventional war to guerrilla war. And if we do that, expect attacks inside Russia on a constant basis. We'll take out your infrastructure, your military bases, your senior leadership, and so on. And if you look at what Israel has done against Iran, targeting their nuclear scientists, this attack is today is very similar to that, and it's been hugely effective in retarding Iran's nuclear timetable. And but unfortunately, it's really antagonized Iran to a huge degree, and we could see that having the same effect in Russia. What happens if Russia decides to use tactical nuclear weapons as a response to terrorism inside its own borders? So there is that risk of escalation.
In terms of trying to shift Russian decision making, if Ukraine is shifting to this guerrilla warfare, how often do you have to pull off these sorts of attacks? With what frequency, over what length of time do you think that you need to keep up that intensity of a guerrilla warfare in order to actually make Vladimir Putin change course in any way?
Well, I think the thing is that when if you're a guerrilla organization involved in trying to get rid of somebody from your country, you have all the time in the world. So you can attack wherever you want on a continual basis. And it's rather like water against rock. Eventually, over time, it has that effect. And as long as you can sustain those activities, then you will have an impact. And well, we've seen that in countless terrorist activities. The Khmer Rouge in Vietnam, and the whole Vietnamese action against the US in the 1960s, Northern Ireland against it wore us down. And of course, more recently in Afghanistan, after 450 deaths in Afghanistan, we, the UK, decided it wasn't worth it. Russia has probably sustained at least 200 to 300,000 deaths in Ukraine. And if it starts suffering equivalent sort of casualties inside Russia, then local support will very quickly sap. And they will get into a position where people say, either you've got to sort these people out or get out. And it will just put more pressure on Vladimir Putin. So he's in a tricky position already because this can't go on forever. And he's just hoping he's going to walk away with a big chunk of Ukraine now. But that may not be the case.
If these talks do get over the line and we get at least a ceasefire, if not a full peace settlement, how sustainable would a guerrilla strategy be? Is that something you can see continuing even after conventional land warfare, air warfare on the front line has stopped?
No, I think Ukraine would like to see a proper peace agreement, and of course it may have to concede territory for that to happen. Um, so that they can return, so that life can return to normal, its economy can return to normal, and Russia can return to normal. That would be a good outcome. I think the worry is that that actually Putin just uses this as a ceasefire, not as a peace, rearms, and then has another go either before or after President Trump has gone. So there's a real worry in that area.
How can Russia defend against say, broader Ukrainian guerrilla campaign, whether that is bombings in Moscow or guerrilla tactics sort of along the front line in eastern parts of Ukraine that Russia occupies? How does Russia stop Ukrainian agents or people aligned with Ukraine killing Russian generals in plain sight, as it did this morning?
It's very hard to do that. It's the enemy within, and when you don't know who the enemy is, it's very hard to find them. Obviously, when we've suffered terrorist attacks in the United Kingdom, we've been able to identify terrorist cells and eliminate them. And of course, Russia would be completely ruthless in doing that, finding these people. Of course, there's a risk of them arresting the wrong people, or people who have Ukrainian links but are not linked to specific attacks. So they would act very strongly to find these people and eliminate them, and they would not have the same rule of law or behaviors that we have here in terms of legality of activities. So, I think I'm sure they would have some success, but I just think it would make Ukrainians more careful about what they're doing to hide their activities.
I'm just going to touch on something you said right at the start of the interview about Ukrainians being able to access Moscow, the sort of more freedom of movement, cultural ties. To say take us back to the Second World War, I can imagine any Briton in Germany would be treated with immense suspicion, and vice versa. The way that Germans were treated in the UK was with immense suspicion. How does that play out in this conflict, for example, where, like you say, there are going to be familial ties across the border. There is a very strong shared cultural history. Indeed, they were part of the same country until the early 1990s. How much more difficult and different is that setting?
Well, again, I would draw the Northern Ireland UK parallel. A lot of English families have connections in Northern Ireland, have moved to Northern Ireland from the UK and vice versa, so that the familial ties are embedded in both cultures. So, what do you do? How do you know? Because a very large percentage of the population could have Ukrainian links or Russian links. And of course, Ukraine has had the same problem with Russian agents operating inside Ukraine, trying to infiltrate high command and find out what's going on. So it's a challenge, obviously, for both sides. I think over time, though, what we've seen since 2022 is that actually the two countries have separated. So Ukraine has become assumed a much more independent identity, and it links with Russia have become less strong than they were before, because a lot of Ukrainians speak Russian. A lot of Ukrainians could infiltrate Russia and pretend to be Russian, and of course that's the risk. And of course, it's a very large country geographically, with a much larger population than the UK. So there are certain practical challenges in terms of finding out who these people are and where they're located.
And you're a land war expert. How likely is it that these operations, this bombing this morning, there is a fairly clear line of command, of communication, of planning from planting the car bomb in Moscow back to the same sorts of commanders, the same branches, which are also commanding Ukraine's war effort on the front line? How much is that linked, or how much is it some random but Ukraine aligned agent inside Moscow, or someone sympathetic to Kyiv?
I'm sure that the Ukrainians have got sleeper agents inside Russia who are ready to perform these activities, and and I think they're probably holding a lot of them in reserve, waiting to see what happens. And I'm sure that right now Ukraine is preparing its a guerrilla campaign against Russia, and it will keep its powder dry until it's ready to act. And I think what it's, going back to what your earlier question, I think today it's demonstrating actually that if we don't agree a peace deal that is acceptable to Ukraine, with certain concessions made by Russia, because let's not forget Russia's made no concessions whatsoever so far. So if Russia doesn't do that, then Ukraine will say, we will take this to the next level, and you better watch out, because they could cause considerable damage. Taking out electricity supplies, water supplies. This could be very unpleasant for Russia.